Welcome to Sierra Capital's Family Office Fundamentals, a podcast dedicated to helping families preserve their legacies and wealth for future generations. I'm your host, Zev Zaretsky, Investment Director at Sierra Capital, a 25-year-old multifamily office focused on guiding ultra-high net worth families globally. In each episode, we'll explore a wide range of topics, including investments, trust and estates, family governance, philanthropy, and much more. Our goal is to provide you with a solid foundation to safeguard your family's financial, intellectual, and human capital for generations to come. Join us on this journey and stay tuned as we hear insightful conversations with industry experts and thought leaders right here on Family Office Fundamentals. Let's embark on this journey together. Please find important disclosures at the end of this podcast. So welcome everyone to Family Office Fundamentals. We're very excited to have two amazing guests with us today. Brett Palmer from the Small Business Investor Alliance and Greg Brown, a professor at University of North Carolina, Kenan-Flagler School of Business. So we're here to chat about a new report that looks at the historical performance of SBICs, or small business investment companies. But first, just a little bit about our guests, and then we'll also have them do their own intros as well. Greg Brown is not just a professor at UNC Kenan-Flagler's Business School, but also research director for Institute of Private Capital. Before joining UNC, he worked at the Board of Governors for the Federal Reserve System in the Division of Research and Statistics. Greg has a Bachelor's of Science in Physics and Economics from Duke University and a PhD in Finance from the University of Texas at Austin. Brett Palmer is the president of the Small Business Investor Alliance. His impressive career includes roles as presidential appointee in the Commerce Department, serving as Assistant Secretary for Legislative Affairs, and as Deputy Assistant Secretary for Trade Legislation. Brett also worked in Congress as a policy aide for the Speaker of the House. He graduated from Davidson College with a degree in history. So we're thrilled to have these experts with us today. And let's get to the conversation and hear what they have to say about the report about SBIC historical performance. So to kick things off, gentlemen, maybe we could start with Brett. Brett, many of our listeners may not exactly know what the SBIA even is. So perhaps you could just spend a minute or two on the SBIA and its mission, in addition to just like a quick rundown of your role and how you found your way working in this niche industry.
Sure. Well, first and foremost, thank you, Zev, for having me here today. As you mentioned, I'm president of the Small Business Investor Alliance. We're a trade association of private equity and private credit funds and their limited partners. It's really focused on investing professionals, focused on the lower middle market, and we really represent that entire private capital ecosystem. It's a trade association designed to develop professional fellowship, which is kind of hard to do in the private equity and private credit markets normally. But we really sort of build that relationships between senior professionals. We try to develop business opportunities to formulate innovation, provide regulatory expertise, and provide market data. We also do a lot in Congress and with regulators, and our public policy goals are really focused on maintaining a robust and healthy and competitive market for investing in American small businesses. So, we're not trying to be everything to everybody. We're really trying to focus on being a trade association that really serves the entire lower middle market and really being the voice of the lower middle market in Congress and with regulators.
That's awesome. How did you end up at the SBIA, Brett?
How'd I end up here? I sort of took a strange path to Washington. I was on my way to medical school when I ended up needed 6 months to figure out something to do for 6 months, and instead I ended up with a job in the Speaker of the House's office back in the early '90s. Fell in love with public policy and economic policy, and the rest is history. But I spent a good portion of my career as an executive branch appointee. My wife likes to joke it took an act of Congress for me to get a job, because it literally did. And I've been running this trade association for 16 years and really trying to develop the small business investment companies and their LPs, and frankly, the entire private credit and private equity markets for 16 years. And it's been very successful. As you mentioned, a lot of folks don't know who we are, and that's okay. We're not trying to be everything to everybody. We're just trying to get the right people in the room and be the voice for those people.
Awesome. Now, Greg, I was hoping, could you do the same and briefly indulge our listeners on what the Institute for Private Capital is, and then also what's your background at the organization.
Yeah, sure. So, as you mentioned, I'm a finance professor at University of North Carolina, and like most faculty at top research schools, spend a lot of my time thinking carefully about what important questions are, especially unanswered questions in finance, and how to go about tackling those questions. And I'd say about 15 years or so ago, there was a real frustration on the part of me and a small group of other academics in terms of how we were going to do more research in the alternative investment space more broadly, because it was just very difficult to get data. So we kind of pulled together this group of researchers from different universities who were willing to sort of go out and tackle this problem. And instead of trying to find individual data sets, that would be collected by a single researcher or their students and then analyzed on sort of an individual basis, how could we be more systematic in trying to get data, not just for individual projects, but that would be broadly available to academic researchers across the entire academy. So that was sort of the seed for the Institute for Private Capital. We started out working in private equity space and built some relationships pretty early on. We met Brett, the SBIA folks, and I think it's a really important area because we know so much of job creation and capital formation, innovation happens with smaller businesses and younger businesses. It's an area that's in that sense especially important to the economy, but especially hard to measure and understand just because there's not the sort of regulatory data that you get from public companies. And so, I would say we've been on this joint quest for a long time to try to go about getting better data, either released by the government or collected through other sources to answer. I guess what seems like really basic questions, like how have these investments performed? What are the risks? What's the cross-sectional, impact in terms of broader economic activity? So, so I think this report we'll talk about a little bit later is a great example of how the academy can collaborate with industry partners and trade groups to really kind of move the ball forward in our understanding of how private investments perform.
That's great. Well, so thanks, guys, for your introductions as well as for being on the podcast. So we're here to discuss the recent paper. It's titled "The Performance of Small Business Investment Companies," and it was recently released. So this paper was co-authored by you, Greg, as well as Professor David Robinson at Duke, Wendy Hugh from MSCI Private Capital Solutions, as well as William Volkman at IPC. So just to do a small little story, when I first started researching SBICs back in 2016, one issue that I had was finding a historical data set of performance. It was pretty much impossible. So instead, I had to go to all the conferences and I kept asking people for their historical performances, created my own little list, went through plenty of marketing funds, and I just had to rely on funds that were still in business and that were still marketing. So at the time, I was the portfolio manager of a very, very, very conservative small bank. We were about 4 billion in assets at the time. They pretty much every bank that size in 2016 got hosed in the great financial crisis. So they were very conservative. They still existed. And so having that historical performance was a necessity to get final approval to invest in pretty much any asset class, even if it was an agency-backed, government bond. It had to have at least, 20 years of history, and we had to be able to quantify that, taking, an appropriate amount of risk. So this paper that was published goes significantly deeper than, my legacy analysis did. And it even helps parse out performance from different asset classes within SBIC funds, different strategies, leverage ratios, et cetera. So the benchmarking was also extremely helpful, as many smaller sized limited partners don't have access to that type of data. A lot of times you have to pay for it and you don't even know where to look. So Brett, maybe you can chime in here a little bit with the background on how this report came. Like, what is it that people on the various boards within the SBIA were talking about that kind of got you guys thinking of, hey, we need this performance report?
Sure. Well, I appreciate that. The SBIC program, the Small Business Investment Company program, is north of $40 billion in assets. It's not an insignificant amount of money, particularly in the small business marketplace. Now, that's, $40 billion isn't a lot in the grand scheme of private equity, but in our part of the world, it's a pretty big chunk. And to your point, the LPs need data, and the government didn't capture that type of data. They didn't report that type of data. They reported, they collected, how many businesses received capital, how much capital, how many jobs were created, things like that. But ultimately, this is a performance-driven program. This isn't a subsidy program. This isn't concessionary capital. This is a market-driven program, and you need performance. And so after years of trying to pull the teeth of the federal government and get the data out of them, I gave up and said, okay, guys, we're going to have to do this ourselves. And so I reached out to the Institute for Private Capital at Kenan-Flagler and said, hey, if we could get this data, would you guys be able to analyze it? And the importance of this data is that it's got to be complete and whole. I don't want to skew the data. I don't want to put the finger on the scale in any way, shape, or form. We need the whole truth as best we can ascertain it. And so I reached out to Greg, and he said, we'd love the data, and this is the type of data we would need. And I reached out to fund manager after fund manager, and everyone across the industry, both LP and GP, pretty much said, hey, we need to do this. And so we reached out, we put together a survey. We got it to Greg and said, hey, is this the right data? And they told us how to tweak it a little bit to make sure it was valid. And we went out and we surveyed the SBIC industry, and we reached out to the LPs and encouraged them to reach out to their GPs to make sure that that data was coming in. And we got a really large data set, and that data set, went directly to Greg. We never saw it on our side. For the most part, a few people sent it to us by mistake, and we said, no, send it to the Institute for Private Capital. It's their study. And he did the analysis, and he'll get into that analysis a little bit, because that analysis covered not only the survey data that we were able to provide, but also some independent sources to validate that data independently, and even bring in some outside data that we didn't have for the survey that confirmed the survey data. So it was really just a necessary thing for the industry to have, because smaller funds are very sensitive to LP needs, because there's a scale challenge of smaller funds that particularly large LPs have challenges with. They have to cut check sizes that are sometimes too big for smaller funds to absorb. And so we really have to make our market case as to why you should invest in this place. And I think that the data that came out was really extraordinary and should be very attractive to a lot of LPs. But the key thing was that it had to be valid. And so Greg can go through the data a little bit if you want, Greg, because it's how we did that and the results that you had.
Yeah. Well, so I was actually gonna go to the next topic, which is pretty much about data, right? Because garbage in, garbage out.
Mm-hmm.
Surely not the case with this report. So Greg, I was hoping that you can take us through just the general process, how you gathered, analyzed, and benchmarked the data, and the conclusions that you came up with to ensure the accuracy.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I'll start by saying, I mean, this is something we've been thinking about for a long time. I don't know, it's probably been almost 10 years, Brett. We've been trying to figure out how to crack this nut in terms of trying to get Congress to release data that would let us do this sort of analysis. And I think ultimately it was just this frustration. We got to do it on our own. And that means going and contacting the funds directly, the GPs directly to get that data, which is really not the preferred way to do, a rigorous academic study, because then you worry about things like selection bias and some people reporting and some people not. And so ideally you'd have sort of mandated or comprehensive reporting of some sort. But that just wasn't going to happen. So instead, we went down this path of doing the survey. But the amazing thing with the survey was just the participation rate. Like usually when people do surveys, they get participation rates of, like 3 or 4% if they're surveying companies or individuals. I mean, the participation rate for this was north of 80% in terms of the GPs that are still in business and were able to get data from. So we actually had 124 different firms give us data on 277 different funds which is just, sort of unprecedented. I think it's just Brett's ability to know all of the players in the industry, probably some arm twisting and multiple phone calls, maybe some light threatening. I don't know what all was involved, but the coverage for the survey was absolutely fantastic. We have vintage years for funds that go all the way back to 1993, all the way up to 2023, but we really focused in on the 2000 to 2020 vintages because the most recent vintages are probably too young to say anything about in terms of final performance. And the stuff that's back prior to 2020 is just a handful of funds. It's, I think, less than 10 funds. And it's sort of a little bit different regime for the SBIC. So we focused in on these 2000 and 2020 funds, and we're able to say quite a bit about them in terms of the performance characteristics across different strategies and over time.
Yeah. So Greg, could you walk us through the general findings of the report? There was actually a 2018 SBA released little pamphlet. It was literally 2 pages. And
yeah,
I don't know if I sent it over to you guys, but it showed a 14% net IRR, and then it quartiled the performance, top quartile, lower quartile. It was all over the place. But 14% was the average for SBICs. I forget when it started. Maybe it was 1998 to 2018. This report shows, close to 17% net, which, look, rates are much lower now than they were back in the late 90s, right? So just general arbitrage could define that. But clearly the data set's a little different. What else did you uncover in your analysis of SBIC funds from that data range that could kind of explain why is it that the returns are actually even higher than the 14?
Sure. Yeah, I mean that SBA pamphlet that you mentioned it's kind of funny because I mean all of the data is in one graph and there's no description of what time period it covers or how many funds it covers or anything. I mean it's really kind of almost weird how little information there is on performance there. So what we have is a really extensive set of tables where we try to slice and dice the data in as many different ways as we can. We look primarily at IRRs and MOICs for these funds. And as you say, when we look at all of the funds that we have data for from the vintages 2000 to 2020, we get 16.9% IRR, which is a really strong number, and a 2.3 MOIC. So, that seems like a really strong number. But again, to be careful in how you interpret that number, you need to be able to say, okay, what is the proper benchmark for these numbers, right? So, obviously the performance is going to vary whether it's a senior debt fund or a junior debt fund or an equity fund, what vintage years, all that sort of stuff. So what we did was try to undertake as careful a benchmarking and exercise as we could, where we said, okay, let's try to compare apples to apples as much as possible. Let's do every fund compared to a similar set of funds for the same vintage year. So if it's a senior debt fund from a 2005 vintage, we'd compare it to a pool of other senior debt funds from 2005 vintage. And we were able to get that comparison benchmark set of funds from data that's provided by MSCI Burgess for a very large universe, what we think is essentially the entire institutional quality set of funds that they collect as part of sort of their overall business activity and provide to academic researchers. So we think that this is about as close a comparison as you could get to non-SBIC funds. We also limited the size of the funds, did all the things that you would sort of want to do to make sure you were comparing apples to apples. And so that 16.9% is about 4% higher than these kind of carefully benchmark funds. That varies a little bit depending on what the percentage of equity is in the fund. So we kind of bucket out whether it's a little bit or a moderate amount or a large amount of equity, and that does vary. Sort of the moderate amount of equity, so you could think of those as being sort of mezz type funds, have the largest outperformance. But in fact, all of those different groups did show better performance for SBICs than for the benchmark funds.
And one thing I would add to that is one of the reasons why the SBA was both unable to put out data or analyze it the way Greg has, and Greg has done it at a great level of granularity, and it's important to separate it the way he has, is when SBICs, these are 10-year lifespan funds, this is sort of similar to a lot of private credit, private equity funds, a 10-year lifespan, 5-year investing period, 5-year harvesting period, give or take, is when the SBA, we didn't talk about how the SBICs are structured. So the SBICs are structured, generally raise private capital, and then you can borrow from this credit facility at a rate of generally 2-to-1. So if you raise 50 million, you can borrow 100 million. Now you have $150 million that's invested, and that's very attractive and very beneficial to the LPs. So that's really important. One of the reasons why they do so much better. But part of that is when the SBICs, pay off the government, they often surrender their licenses, and then the SBA goes data blind. So they don't see a lot of the upside of the final, termination of the fund, where the LPs do, particularly the LPs, and there are hundreds and hundreds of LPs that are, in this space, they get it. But it made it very difficult for the SBA to tell the full and complete story of the performance of the funds. That's part of what Greg did, and really, digging down deep into these funds for their entire life, and by their strategy and their equity ratio and this SBA leverage ratio, because having that fixed cost of capital on leverage at 2-to-1 is a really big deal.
Yeah. Yeah. See, part of the outperformance though, right? Because obviously the 2-to-1 ratio helps. And of course it's, pretty significantly cheaper financing than in private markets for these funds. But an interesting point is that, at least from what the data was showing, the highest leverage of 2-to-1 was actually not the best performing. It was somewhere in the middle of, like 1x levered to 2x levered. I don't know if you could explain that, Greg.
Yeah. Yeah. So what we did was we want to understand, how important is the additional leverage that SBICs get in terms of determining performance. And, it could be, theoretically just that, okay, you're getting more performance because you're taking more risk. And so on a risk adjusted basis, there really isn't much outperformance. So we wanted to try to dig into the, additional leverage that SBICs get as carefully as possible. So what we essentially did was create leverage quartiles. There's some SBICs that have very low leverage. They tended to perform roughly in line with the benchmarks. So that sort of suggests there isn't like, it isn't like the super geniuses of the world are all, inside of SBICs making investment decisions. These are just people that are making, good quality investment decisions like other investors in the private market or middle market space. But then when you started moving into sort of, more moderate levels of leverage, you started to see outperformance. And as you said, interestingly, it wasn't the highest leverage funds that had the top performance. So there wasn't something just about taking on more leverage or more risk. There was something about taking a prudent amount of additional leverage from SBIC, a prudent amount of additional risk, and essentially providing that capital to the companies that needed it most, that maximized returns. And I think from an economic perspective, that's super interesting for me, because what it says is that, okay, where are the highest returns coming from? It looks like they're coming from, these kind of moderately levered, modest equity, think of them again as like mezz type funds, where they're really generating really high returns. Why is that? Because these are probably the companies that are most starved for capital, least likely to be able to get it from other places, and able to then generate the highest returns So from a policy standpoint, it seems like this is a real win. And that you're really providing capital to companies that are using it very efficiently, and in the sense that they're able to generate a lot of additional economic activity with it. So, typically it was like between 1 and 1.75 of the SBA leverage is where the returns were highest, though it did vary a little bit by type of strategy. So, we saw that actually for the equity strategies, kind of lower leverage between half a turn and 1 turn of SBIC leverage is where the maximum returns came from.
Yeah. Yeah. I also think that just lower middle market is a great place to be, especially here in the United States. Clearly financial institutions, particularly the banks that, that I talk to, that I used to work at, there's a CRA, Community Reinvestment Act component to investing in SBIC funds. And so for those not familiar with SBICs or just learning about them now, SBICs are a strong component of any bank's CRA exam results. Brett, I was wondering, maybe you could include some thoughts on how SBIC funds differ from like typical the connotation is, oh, the private equity fund just wants to buy a company and, they just want to take it over and make it efficient, buy a bunch of other guys, consolidate it, and then sell it. But there's something different when it comes to the lower middle market, especially with SBICs, because they're investing in low, moderate income areas. They're investing in a lot of rural areas. And so I didn't know if maybe you had some stats or if you just had some stuff up off the top of the head.
Sure. So Community Reinvestment Act is a sort of a scorecard for banks as far as what they're doing with their capital. And it's sometimes referred to as CRA credit. There's not actually a mathematical component to it. It is very soft, and that causes a lot of the banks to be very frustrated with it. And I very much understand that. But the thing about the SBICs is the SBICs are, clearly in the guidance of the federal regulators, permitted CRA investments. And unlike some CRA investments, which are frankly donations, where you're taking 100%, loss, instead you're getting real market returns for those investments, and you're doing what the Community Reinvestment Act was always supposed to do, which was invest in communities. As Greg pointed out, these type of businesses are cash strapped, capital starved. The capital markets are not very efficient for these part of the markets. It's very easy at the high end, a big business, but smaller businesses, even if they're great businesses, still have trouble accessing capital. And so these investments that are coming in are letting these businesses grow. They're letting them reinvest and reinvent themselves. And so they've created millions of jobs. And generally, the only way a lower middle market company makes money is to grow. And so it's something that people, particularly banks, can be proud of. And when they make these investments, they get really good returns. And it really benefits the communities long after that investment is done and completed. I remember about 15 years ago, we did a panel with some very senior banking regulators across all the banking regulators. And we had some frontline analysts at the banks giving a presentation. And one of the frontline examiners at the time, they knew very little about SBIC funds. And they said, I would value a $500 donation to a community organizer higher than I would a $5 million investment in some business or some manufacturer. And I turned around, I looked at the senior officials at these banking regulators, and I said, see, you got a problem. And the senior banking officials literally walked to the front of the room and said, stop, this is wrong. We've got a problem. And we're going to retrain these folks because this is exactly what we need to be doing. And so they've done that repeatedly. And the SBIC funds in a lot in the Q&A of the Federal Reserve and in the other banking regulators are really trying to make sure that it's clear that they get those credits, because this is the type of investment that banks can and should be doing, both from a financial standpoint as well as from a good citizenship standpoint. So, you have a significant number, about 1 out of 5 of these investments are in low and moderate income areas. A number of them are in rural areas. Manufacturing varies from year to year, but generally between 20 and 30% of the investments. And these investments are generally not going to the hyper concentrated areas where venture capital and large private equity is deploying capital. It's much more geographically dispersed by state, by concentration. And it's hard to invest in rural areas and low income areas. I mean, there's just less opportunity, but it's not impossible. And so these are the type of investments that banks can be very proud of, while at the same time getting really, really strong returns. And that's sort of a really rare overlap in the Venn diagram of CRA. And that's why we see hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of banks, big and small, deploying capital into SBICs, and in some cases owning their own SBICs outright.
Awesome. Thanks. So, Brett, I guess last thing, while I still have you here, maybe you can give our listeners a quick status update on anything exciting, anything new, exciting, something like that's keeping you up at night, that's in the pipeline at the SBIA.
Sure. Well, the Small Business Investment Company has been around since the 50s. And, it really was the foundation of the beginning of the modern venture capital industry and a lot of what is now the private equity industry. It started off as, these small funds doing things, and it's grown and evolved over time. And, when I started in 2008, the financial crisis was going on. It was pretty messy, as you can remember, and we all hope nothing like that ever happens again. But the SBICs did really well in that time and following. And that's continued. And so you've seen a significant growth in the number of small business investment companies. There are currently over 130 license applications currently pending at the SBA. That's depending upon the size of them, and we don't have clear sight as to what the size of each would be, but that's at a minimum $20 billion of additional capital, maybe as much as $35 billion more capital coming online in the next couple of years. And that's really positive. The SBA is building out new tools. They have the classic SBIC debenture tool, which is really attractive to MES, but they're also building out some new tools for funds of funds, which is brand new and very interesting and different. They're creating some new tools for equity-oriented funds, which is really skews towards growth equity and buyout, again, on the small side. And so there's a greater diversity of strategies that are going to be able to use these tools. There's also a very significant partnership with the Department of Defense that a number of, they're called critical technology SBICs are forming. These aren't necessarily government contractors, but are in areas that the United States has deemed critical to our future. So they're defense adjacent, where there's some interesting stuff going on there too. So I think you see a significant broadening out of the LP base. I think you see a significant broadening out of the GP base. I think you see a significant broadening out of the investing strategies that are available. And so that's exciting. That's going to take a lot more education because for a lot of folks, it's just SBIC, like what is that acronym? I don't even know. So we're taking a lot of time to do the education. And we at SBIA do a lot of connecting and matchmaking between the GPs and the LPs. We also do a lot of LP only events where LPs can get in the room and ask other LPs who have been in this space for a while, what's this really like? Let them do their due diligence. Can't do anything anti-competitive, and we would never allow for that. But we are allowed to, frankly, let the LPs say, "Hey, I really like this fund," or "Hey, they're not all that," or "I don't like the way they're reporting." We really want to make sure we have a real partnership between GPs and LPs, where it's not a windfall for either. And so that's what we try to do with our conferences, with our Capital Links matchmaking services. So we're excited about the growth and the diversification of the space, and are really hopeful that more gaps can get filled because there clearly are some major gaps that are out there in the rural, in industry sectors, in low-income areas. And again, these aren't subsidy programs, and these aren't grants to anyone. This is real market-based capital. That's market-driven capital. And as a believer in markets, I think there's a lot more markets can do to expand the footprint of American prosperity.
I guess going back to the data though, so with all these new programs and all these, and with so many funds in the pipe, do you guys have something set up at the SBIA now to be collecting this data on an ongoing basis, or is it going to be another ask 5 years down the road?
But we're gonna try to keep this updated and extend it for everyone who's reported and expand the number of people who are reporting. And that we need LPs help to do that because a little nudge from the LPs is really helpful in getting the GPs to produce that. But also the SBA has changed the way the data is reported to them, where historically they didn't use GAAP reporting. They had something called statutory reporting that was very rigid, which was very helpful. It was very protective of the taxpayer, but it didn't report data the same way that LPs are used to seeing data. And now SBICs are going to have to report both. And so with time, we're going to be able to, instead of having just 80% of the SBICs reporting, we'll be able to get up to 100%. But it's going to take some time for that. And again, I think as Greg pointed out, it's important to differentiate by size, by vintage year, by strategy, by leverage ratio, by equity ratio, by industry participation. And I expect that will continue going forward, but it'll take a couple of years to really build out that data set. And when that does, I really hope the IPC can dig in because they do an extraordinary job of analyzing not just this sector, but a number of other sectors.
And Greg, I saw there was another paper recently published from IPC about SBICs as well, right?
Yeah, I mean, we've been trying to do whatever we can on the SBIC front, and one of my co-authors, David Robinson, on this paper has done some work with sort of more granular SBA data as well. So it's an area that we're super interested in. Again, because we think it's just a really important part of capital markets that's underserved, and there's just a lot of economic gain that can come from trying to do more work in the lower middle market. So it's a really interesting part of our broader research agenda. And we've really enjoyed working with SBIA. And my hope is this turns into an annual survey. So we're able to keep it really up to date for investors so they can feel comfortable making more allocations to the lower middle market.
Honestly, I could tell you that pretty much everyone would appreciate that. So,
And one thing I'd add there, Zev, is that the IPC for the LPs that are listening really does some pretty extraordinary research on a whole range of verticals. The SBICs, on real estate, on a bunch of alternatives. And it's worth taking a look at. Again, it's nonpartisan, it's not pay to play, it's bona fide academic inquiry. And it's worth taking a look at some of those things.
absolutely. Well, I got to at least give this new report. Just got flagged like a few days ago. All right, guys. I don't know if you have any other commentary or final thoughts you wanted to leave listeners with. Yeah. Well, if it's okay, would you guys mind if I put your emails in the description?
That's great with me, and I'll just say, again, thanks, Ed, for the opportunity, and also reiterate that all of our research is public domain. It's not, like Brett said, pay to play or sponsored research or anything. We're all independent academic researchers, and really just trying to forward the public understanding of private markets.
Well, thanks, Greg. Appreciate it. It was awesome meeting you, and Brett, you as well. I'm sure I'll be seeing you at the next event down in Palm Beach.
I hope to see Greg down there too. So we'll get the three of us together. So thank you so much, Greg, for doing the research, and to the rest of the team, and David and everybody else, and Zev, thank you so much. And I look forward to seeing you soon. Call me anytime.
The information presented in this podcast is the opinion of Sierra Capital and does not reflect the view of any other person or entity. The information provided is believed to be from reliable sources, but no liability is accepted for any inaccuracies. This is for information purposes only and should not be construed as an investment recommendation.